Number 10. The warnings before the Black Death reached Europe. Some historical disasters seem, in retrospect, like they erupted from nowhere. The Black Death is more unsettling because warning existed long before Europe fully understood what was coming. The disease did not materialize at the exact moment people began dying in European streets. It moved through trade routes, frontier zones, rumors, military spaces, and scattered reports before it ever became the full catastrophe later generations would remember. That is what makes this case so dark. The warning signs were not absent. They were simply too fragmented, too distant, and too easy to misread, until the plague was already close enough that interpretation no longer mattered. What gave these warnings their strange power was the fact that they did not arrive in one clean form. There were reports of sickness elsewhere, stories of devastation moving across regions, and signs that something deeply abnormal was taking shape beyond the ordinary rhythm of disease. But medieval societies did not possess a modern epidemiological framework that could gather scattered danger into a single scientific forecast. That means the warnings existed inside a world that could feel their dread without fully explaining it. When signs cannot be integrated clearly, they often become background noise rather than decisive alarm. And that is where the tragedy deepens. Trade, travel, and commercial exchange kept moving. Ports remained points of connection. Routes that brought wealth and communication also brought death nearer. This is one of history's most haunting patterns. The same systems that make a civilization rich, linked, and expansive can become the channels through which warning arrives too late to stop the thing being warned about. Europe was not blind in the simple sense. It was embedded in networks whose danger was not yet understood in time to interrupt them. There is also something especially eerie about how rumor functions before plague becomes visible at home. A city hearing that another city has suffered can still imagine distance as protection. Suffering elsewhere often feels informational rather than immediate. The future remains safely located in somebody else's present. That illusion is powerful. It lets societies continue ordinary life even while the first outlines of catastrophe are already visible. By the time rumor becomes local fact, the psychological window for prevention has narrowed or vanished. That is why the Black Death belongs in this video. The warnings before it reached Europe were not like a modern engineer's memo or a captain's ice report. They were stranger, more dispersed, and more entangled with uncertainty. But they were still warnings. They signaled that something enormous was moving across connected worlds. The failure was not only intellectual, it was structural. No one could fully stop living inside the systems already carrying the danger closer. And once the plague arrived, all ambiguity ended brutally. The reports from elsewhere were no longer distant stories. They became local reality in the form of mass death, social terror, economic fracture, and spiritual crisis. That transformation is what makes the earlier warning signs feel so chilling in retrospect. The future had already announced itself, but only in a language people were not ready or not able to hear with enough urgency. In the end, the warnings before the Black Death reached Europe belong at number 10 because they show one of history's oldest and darkest truths. Catastrophe often casts a shadow before it arrives. But if that shadow is spread across rumor, distance, and partial knowledge, human beings will often keep moving toward it until it is too close to escape. Number 9. The warnings before the Salem witch trials spiraled. Some warnings are technical, others are moral and social, and those may be harder to heed because they require people to admit that their own fear is becoming dangerous. Salem belongs on this list because the warning signs before the trials spiraled were already present in the atmosphere of the community itself. Strange accusations, escalating emotional behavior, intensifying certainty, expanding suspicion, and the growing willingness to treat invisible harm as undeniable fact were all signs that something was going badly wrong. That is what makes Salem so unsettling. The danger was not hiding, it was building in public. What gave the early warnings their power was the speed with which ordinary boundaries began to weaken. Once accusations of witchcraft started being treated as credible enough to investigate through spectral claims and fearful testimony, the legal and moral balance of the community shifted. That shift should have been its own warning. A society becomes very dangerous to itself the moment it starts accepting evidence that cannot be tested in ordinary ways, yet carries the full emotional force of certainty. Salem was moving toward that point before the executions made the catastrophe obvious. And there were other warning signs too. Personal tensions, local rivalries, religious pressure, factional conflict, and the emotional intensity of a tightly wound Puritan world all helped create a setting where fear could grow faster than restraint. None of these things automatically produce witch trials, but together they created the kind of social climate in which accusations could multiply and hesitation could start to look suspicious. The community was no longer simply reacting to individual cases. It was becoming primed to confirm its own panic. That is what makes the pre-collapse phase of Salem so important. The warnings were not only in what people said, but in how the system responded. Authority figures gave room to unstable claims. The afflicted gained interpretive power. The accused became harder to defend without risking contamination by association. The court structure began amplifying fear rather than containing it. These are all classic warning signs of a society entering a self-reinforcing spiral. Every new act of caution is reinterpreted as proof that the threat must be real. There is also something especially dark about the fact that some people did sense the danger, but not strongly enough, not early enough, or not with enough institutional power to stop it. That matters because Salem was not an example of total ignorance. It was an example of a community crossing thresholds one by one until reversal became harder with each step. Once fear becomes embedded in procedure, warning voices struggle because they sound, to the frightened, like obstacles to justice rather than defenses against madness. That is why Salem belongs in a video about ignored warnings. The real red flags were social. A village was teaching itself to believe that accusation could outrun proof, that invisible crime justified visible punishment, and that doubt itself could be morally compromised. Those were warnings of collapse before the full cruelty unfolded. But because they arrived inside a culture already predisposed to spiritual fear, they were absorbed into the logic of the trials, instead of treated as alarms against them. In the end, the warnings before the Salem witch trials spiraled were warnings about the community itself. The signs were there in the expanding panic, the loosening standards of evidence, and the growing confidence that hidden evil could be rooted out through accusation. By the time that process looked undeniably monstrous, the machinery of fear had already learned how to keep feeding itself. Number 8. The warnings. Before the Franklin expedition vanished, some warnings arrived through prophecy or rumor. The Franklin expedition is more chilling because many of its warnings were practical, visible, and built into the expedition before it ever disappeared into the Arctic. That is what makes the case so dark. This was not simply a story of brave explorers overwhelmed by an unknowable wilderness. It was also a story of confidence moving into an environment where confidence itself could become fatal. The ships were heavily provisioned, technologically ambitious, and backed by imperial certainty, yet signs of vulnerability were already present long before the final silence settled over the expedition. What gave those warnings their force was the nature of Arctic travel itself. Ice does not forgive miscalculation, and time behaves differently there. If ships are trapped too long, supplies become more than inventory. They become the boundary between order and unraveling. A delay is not just inconvenience, it is a transformation of the entire expedition's future. The Franklin mission entered that world carrying all the optimism of 19th century naval power, but optimism cannot melt pack ice. That mismatch between imperial self-confidence and environmental reality is one of the expedition's earliest warnings. There were also more specific concerns. Arctic conditions had already defeated or humbled earlier ventures. The region was known to be punishing, unpredictable, and capable of turning technical sophistication into dead weight if the season shifted badly enough. This was not an unknown danger in the absolute sense. It was a known danger that people hoped superior preparation, discipline, and design could finally master. That is often how warnings get ignored in history. They are not denied outright. They are acknowledged and then reclassified as challenges the present generation believes itself uniquely equipped to overcome. What makes the Franklin case especially haunting is that later evidence suggests internal disaster building step by step after the expedition became trapped. Lead contamination, illness, starvation, the failure of supplies to secure survival, and the slow collapse of structure all point toward a catastrophe that did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened through accumulation. That means the warning signs were not only before departure, they were also embedded in the logic of how the expedition had been organized. Dependence on preserved supplies, on ship endurance, on timing, on hierarchy, on the belief that the system would remain coherent deep into conditions that punished coherence mercilessly. There is also something especially unsettling about the silence surrounding the expedition. Once no word returned, the missing ships became a blank space large enough to absorb both fear and romanticism. But before they vanished into that silence, the warning pattern had already existed. The Arctic had warned others before. The scale of the undertaking warned by its very ambition. The environment warned through its indifference. The expedition still moved forward because imperial exploration is often powered by the belief that difficulty proves necessity rather than danger. That is why this case belongs on the list. The Franklin expedition did not ignore one neat memo or one final signal. It ignored a deeper class of warning, the kind embedded in overconfidence, environmental hostility, and the assumption that civilization's tools would hold even where nature had repeatedly shown its power to break them. Once the expedition entered that logic, every setback became harder to reverse. In the end, the warnings before the Franklin expedition vanished were the warnings of scale, climate, and human certainty meeting a landscape that had no reason to care. The disappearance still haunts because it leaves room for mystery. But the real darkness lies in how much danger was already visible in the undertaking long before the ice closed around it. Number 7. The warnings before the Jonestown mass death. Some warnings are hard to see because they are buried under distance or technical uncertainty. Jonestown is more disturbing because the warnings were human, repeated, and increasingly explicit. The danger did not come from a hidden volcano or an unseen flaw in a machine. It came from a community spiraling deeper into control, paranoia, isolation, and obedience around a single leader whose instability was becoming harder and harder to mistake. That is what makes Jonestown so devastating. The signs were not absent. The living were trapped inside them. What gave those warnings their force was the gradual tightening of Jim Jones's authority. At first, commitment could be framed as idealism, discipline, sacrifice, or collective purpose. But over time, the pattern darkened. Reports of coercion, surveillance, punishments, rehearsals for death, emotional domination, and the severing of members from independent reality all pointed towards something far more dangerous than an unconventional movement. A society can ignore many warnings if each one arrives separately. Jonestown became catastrophic because the warnings formed a pattern, and that pattern kept intensifying. There were also the warnings given by defectors, relatives, journalists, and former insiders. They described abuse, fear, and the atmosphere of psychological captivity that had developed around Jones. Those warnings mattered because they came from people close enough to the system to understand how abnormal it had become. Yet one of the most painful truths about cultic control is that outside warnings often weaken as the inner world hardens. The more isolated and suspicious the group becomes, the easier it is to reinterpret criticism as persecution. Warning is heard not as rescue, but as attack. That is what made Jonestown so unstable by the time final catastrophe approached. The group was geographically distant, psychologically enclosed, and emotionally organized around a leader who increasingly fused grievance, apocalyptic thinking, and total control. Once a community reaches that point, warnings do not merely go unheard. They can become fuel for the leader's narrative. Evidence of danger becomes evidence that enemies are closing in. Concern becomes confirmation of siege. The very attempt to intervene can intensify the logic of destruction. What makes the case especially chilling is the role of rehearsal. The so-called White Nights were among the clearest warnings imaginable. A community repeatedly practicing collective death under leadership command is not near ordinary instability. It is approaching the edge of annihilation. And yet even then the structure held because obedience, fear, exhaustion, and dependence had become stronger than the ordinary instinct to flee. This is one of history's darkest patterns. The warning becomes unmistakable only after the system has already taught people how not to trust their own alarm. There is also something uniquely painful about the human nearness of Jonestown's warnings. These were not obscure omens from ancient chronicles. They were letters, testimonies, visible fear, family pleas, investigative concerns, and behaviors so abnormal that they should have shattered the illusion much earlier. But systems of domination are powerful precisely because they do not rely on one lie. They build whole emotional worlds in which warning signs are reclassified as tests of loyalty. That is why Jonestown belongs so high on this list. The mass death did not arrive out of a clear sky. It was preceded by escalating red flags about coercion, dependency, apocalyptic rehearsal, and the psychological collapse of a community into one man's destructive control. The tragedy was not merely that no one knew. It was that enough was known, and yet the structure had already grown strong enough to carry so many people toward the end anyway. In the end, the warnings before Jonestown were warnings about what happens when fear, obedience, and charismatic power become a sealed system. The disaster still feels almost unbelievable because the final act was so extreme. But the real horror is that the path toward it had been visible for some time and still proved terribly hard to stop. Number 6. The omens and warnings before Caesar's assassination. Some warnings are mechanical, others are wrapped in ritual, rumor, and the uneasy sense that a society already knows something is going wrong before the knife is ever raised. Julius Caesar's assassination belongs to that second category. What makes it so haunting is not only that he was killed, but that Roman memory surrounded the event with an atmosphere of forewarning. Omens, strange signs, anxious prophecies, uneasy dreams, and the repeated sense that too many people could feel the strain building inside the Republic even if they could not stop it. That is what gives this case its power. The warnings before Caesar's death were not just about one man's physical danger. They were about a political order becoming unstable enough that the future started feeling charged. Rome was already full of faction, resentment, ambition, and fear of monarchy. Caesar's rise did not create those tensions from nothing, but it concentrated them. Once one figure becomes too central, too triumphant, too difficult to oppose through normal means, a republic begins sending signals of distress long before open violence restores balance in the ugliest possible way. And that is why the omens matter, even if one reads them symbolically rather than supernaturally. Warnings in ancient Rome often worked as emotional truth. Unnatural events, seers, sacrificial irregularities, dreams, and whispered cautions gave form to a larger feeling. The state was moving towards something catastrophic. The famous warning to beware the Ides of March survives not because it was the only sign, but because it crystallizes the whole atmosphere. Rome had become the kind of political world where warning no longer sounded absurd. It sounded late. What makes this especially chilling is that Caesar reportedly encountered warnings in multiple forms and still moved forward. That detail matters because it reveals one of history's most persistent patterns. Powerful people often hear warning differently from everyone else. Repeated caution may begin to feel like background noise, envy, ritual formalism, or the ordinary turbulence of prominence. Once a leader has survived enough risk, he may begin assuming that danger is permanent but manageable. That is exactly when warning becomes easiest to discount. There is also a deeper social warning here beyond the famous omens. Caesar's assassination happened in a republic already struggling to contain personal power, military loyalty, elite fear, and constitutional strain. The signs were not only in sacrifices and dreams, they were in the political culture itself. A state in which major actors increasingly see murder as a solution has already crossed many thresholds before the actual murder occurs. The real omen was Rome's internal condition. That is why Caesar belongs in this video. The warning signs were not mysterious in the sense of being unintelligible. They were plentiful enough to form a pattern. But patterns are hardest to act on when they threaten to interrupt a story of inevitability. Caesar's confidence, the conspirators' resolve, and Rome's elite breakdown all fed into a final moment that feels shocking only if one ignores how much dread had already gathered around it. In the end, the warnings before Caesar's assassination belong on this list because they show how a society can sense disaster before it happens and still move toward it anyway. Whether through omens, prophecy, private fear, or political intuition, Rome had already begun warning itself that something was fatally wrong. The Ides of March did not come without signs. They came after too many signs had already been absorbed into the normal atmosphere of crisis. Number 5. The ignored signals before the Challenger disaster. Some warnings in history are vague enough to dismiss. The Challenger disaster is more disturbing because the warning signs were technical, specific, and tied directly to the conditions of launch. That is what makes the case so dark. This was not a mysterious catastrophe people only understood afterward. Engineers had concerns. The weather was abnormal. The risk was discussed. The danger had a shape. And yet the launch still proceeded. That is one of the clearest and most painful historical examples of warning failing, not because it was invisible, but because institutions found ways to move past it. What gave those warnings such force was the cold itself. The shuttle was scheduled to launch in unusually low temperatures, and concerns centered around the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters, components whose performance under such conditions was already a matter of serious worry. This is what makes the story so unsettling. The warning was not abstract. It lived exactly at the intersection of known technical vulnerability and real environmental conditions on the day of action. And yet technical truth does not automatically become institutional truth. That is one of the darkest lessons of the Challenger disaster. Organizations under pressure do not always ignore warning openly. They reinterpret it. Concerns become manageable concerns. Uncertainty becomes acceptable uncertainty. Delay becomes the greater threat to schedules, image, momentum, or decision culture. In that environment, the question stops being, is this safe? And starts becoming, can we still justify going ahead? Once that shift happens, warning is already in danger. What makes Challenger especially painful is that the people raising concerns were not speaking in hindsight. They were speaking beforehand. That detail transforms the disaster from tragic accident into something more morally charged. It reveals a failure of listening. Engineers and technical voices had identified a serious problem, but the structure above them converted the warning into a negotiable part of decision-making instead of treating it as the center of the decision itself. There is also something profoundly modern about this kind of ignored signal. Ancient omens can be dismissed as belonging to symbolic worlds. Challenger occurred inside a culture of engineering, management, expertise, and high technology. That is what should have made warning easier to heed. Instead, it reveals how advanced systems can still fail in painfully human ways, through normalization of risk, organizational momentum, communication breakdown, and the subtle pressure to make the launch happen, because too much has already been arranged around it. That is why Challenger belongs so high on this list. The disaster exposes how institutions can become most dangerous when they are close enough to the truth to know the risk, but not disciplined enough to let that truth stop them. The warning signs were not weak. They were made weak by the decision culture surrounding them. That is far more frightening than simple ignorance. In the end, the ignored signals before the Challenger disaster show one of history's clearest forms of preventable catastrophe. The future sent warning through engineering, weather, and expert concern. But warning only saves people if institutions allow it to interrupt the plan. In this case, it did not. And that is why the disaster still feels so haunting. Not because no one knew danger existed, but because enough was known and the launch happened anyway. Number 4. The warnings before Chernobyl. Some disasters are frightening because of what they destroy. Chernobyl is more unsettling because the warning signs existed inside the system long before the reactor exploded. That is what makes the case so dark. The catastrophe was not born in one instant of bad luck. It grew inside a culture of denial, design vulnerability, procedural arrogance, and institutional pressure in which warning could be noticed, yet still fail to stop the momentum toward disaster. What gave those warnings their force was that they were not all hidden in obscure theory. There were known concerns about reactor behavior, safety culture, communication, and the way authority operated inside the Soviet nuclear system. The RBMK design had dangerous characteristics, especially under certain conditions, and the broader environment in which operators worked was not one that encouraged transparent confrontation with risk. This is one of history's most chilling patterns. A technical system becomes more dangerous when the political culture around it punishes hesitation more than it punishes error. And that is what made Chernobyl more than an industrial accident. It was a warning failure built into hierarchy itself. Operators and managers did not act inside a neutral world of pure engineering. They acted inside a state culture where meeting expectations, preserving appearances, and moving through procedure could take precedence over fully reckoning with danger. Once institutions train people to fear embarrassment, delay, or contradiction more than catastrophe, the path to catastrophe has already begun. What makes the case especially haunting is the test itself. The explosion emerged during a safety test meant, in principle, to address emergency conditions. That irony matters. A system attempting to prepare for crisis ended up exposing how poorly it handled the reality of risk. The conditions around the test, the choices made, and the way technical vulnerability interacted with human decision-making all show the same disturbing truth. Warning does not fail only because people do not know enough. It also fails because they know inside a structure that does not let knowledge act freely. There is also something uniquely terrifying about nuclear warning signs because the danger is partly invisible. A fire can be seen, structural collapse can be heard. Radiation does not announce itself in ordinary human terms. That means institutions and experts become even more important in translating warning into action. If those institutions are compromised by secrecy, prestige, or fear of blame, then society becomes defenseless against dangers it cannot read for itself. That is exactly what makes Chernobyl feel larger than one plant. It was a state-level failure of truth under pressure, and once the reactor exploded, the pattern continued. Delayed recognition, minimization, and secrecy shaped the immediate aftermath, deepening exposure and confusion. This is what makes ignored warnings so devastating. They are rarely confined to the moment before the event. The same habits that prevent prevention often also corrupt response. A system that cannot face danger early usually cannot narrate danger honestly once it has arrived. That is why Chernobyl belongs on this list. The warning signs were technical, institutional, and cultural all at once. The disaster still feels so morally heavy because the future had already tried to announce itself through design flaws, unsafe assumptions, and a brittle system of authority. But the warning arrived inside a structure trained to contain discomfort rather than truth. In the end, the warnings before Chernobyl show one of history's darkest modern lessons. Catastrophe becomes almost inevitable when a dangerous technology is governed by a political culture that treats transparency as weakness. The reactor exploded once, but the deeper disaster had begun earlier in all the ways the system had learned not to listen to its own alarms. Number 3. The Cassandra warnings around the fall of Troy. Some warnings are technical enough to verify. Others are tragic because they are clear in meaning but powerless against the will of those who do not want to hear them. Cassandra's warnings around the fall of Troy belong to that second category, and that is what makes them so haunting. Whether approached through myth, literature, or cultural memory, Cassandra became one of history's most enduring symbols of foreknowledge ignored. She saw disaster coming, spoke it, and remained trapped in the unbearable position of being right without being believed. That is what gives the Trojan warning its lasting force. The story is not simply that Troy fell. It is that warning existed inside the city before the fall and still failed. This is a deeper kind of tragedy than ordinary surprise. If no one could have known, collapse feels cruel. If someone did know and was dismissed, collapse feels self-inflicted. Cassandra represents that terrible possibility. The presence of truth inside a doomed society that can no longer recognize truth as useful. What makes this case especially powerful is the symbolic setting. Troy is already a city at the edge of exhaustion, war, pride, and fate. In that atmosphere, Cassandra's warnings do more than predict one event. They reveal a city psychologically unable to save itself. The danger is not only the Greeks outside the walls. The danger is Troy's inability to hear what contradicts its desire, its pride, or its exhaustion. Once a society reaches that point, warning becomes almost ceremonial. It is spoken less to prevent catastrophe than to mark that catastrophe morally before it arrives. And that is why the Trojan horse matters so much in the larger warning tradition. The horse is one of history's great images of fatal misreading, an object that should invite suspicion, yet is reclassified as victory, gift, or fate fulfilled. Cassandra's resistance to that acceptance becomes the sharpest sign that the city still has one chance left to distrust the story it most wants to believe. That chance fails. The people move toward ruin not because no alarm exists, but because the alarm is too painful to accept. There is also something deeply human about why warning fails here. People do not ignore Cassandra because warning is difficult to understand. They ignore her because warning demands renunciation. To heed her would mean rejecting triumph, reopening fear, and admitting that what looks like resolution may actually be the doorway to annihilation. That is one of the oldest reasons warning signs fail. They are not intellectually impossible, they are emotionally unbearable. That is why Cassandra survives far beyond Troy itself. She becomes the archetype of every voice that sees disaster before it happens and cannot break through the psychology of denial around it. In that sense, this case belongs in the video, not merely as mythic material, but as one of the oldest and most exact portraits of warning ignored until the city burns. In the end, the Cassandra warnings around the fall of Troy belong at number 3 because they capture the purest, tragic form of forewarning. The truth is spoken, the danger is named, and the people most in need of hearing it cannot let it interrupt the story they want to live inside. Troy falls later in flames. In a deeper sense, it begins falling the moment it chooses not to believe the voice that tried to save it. Number 2. The ignored ice reports before the Titanic. Some warnings in history are wrapped in myth after the fact. The Titanic is more unsettling because the warnings were concrete, repeated, and transmitted in the ordinary language of navigation. That is what makes the case so dark. The ship did not meet ice in a world without signals. Ice reports had already been sent. Other vessels had noted dangerous conditions. The North Atlantic was telling the truth clearly enough. But the truth arrived inside a culture of speed, prestige, confidence, and routine, and that made it easier to treat warning as background rather than command. What gave those warnings their force was their sheer practicality. This was not prophecy, it was not superstition, it was not one frightened rumor, it was information from ships already in the region, reporting the presence and spread of ice. That matters because it strips away one of the usual excuses history offers itself. The danger was not invisible. It had been described in usable terms by people with direct reason to know what they were talking about. And yet warning does not operate in a vacuum. The Titanic existed not only as a ship, but as a symbol of modern engineering, luxury, and confidence. That symbolic weight changed the emotional environment in which information was received. When an institution or machine carries enough prestige, caution can begin to feel like inconvenience rather than necessity. The larger the myth of mastery, the easier it becomes to imagine that hazard can be managed without truly interrupting momentum. In that sense, the ignored ice reports were colliding not only with a ship, but with an attitude. There is also something especially chilling about the role of routine. Maritime systems rely on constant communication, repeated observations, and the practical translation of warning into action. But repeated warning can become its own danger when people are too accustomed to hearing alerts without immediate disaster following. Familiarity breeds tolerance. Tolerance breeds delay. Delay at sea under the wrong conditions becomes fate. The Titanic did not need one dramatic ignored message alone. It only needed enough warning to be normalized rather than obeyed. What makes the case more haunting is how small the required change might have been. A greater reduction in speed, a more conservative interpretation of the ice field, a different response to accumulation rather than one report in isolation. Disasters of this kind are terrifying because they reveal how little must go wrong once enough people decide the ordinary forward motion of the system should continue. The ship remains on course not because danger is absent, but because the burden of changing course has become emotionally heavier than the burden of trusting luck. And that is one of the darkest truths here. Warning often fails not because human beings lack information, but because they are already invested in a story of progress that warning would interrupt. The Titanic was meant to represent confidence and arrival. Ice reports represented friction, delay, caution, and the admission that nature still had final authority. Under those conditions, the future becomes harder to hear because it sounds like inconvenience instead of catastrophe. That is why the Titanic belongs at number 2. The ship's sinking still haunts because the disaster sits at the intersection of warning and pride. The future had been signaled in radio messages crossing the same waters the liner cut through, but the ship kept moving, and history has never quite stopped being unsettled by the simplicity of that fact. The ocean warned first. The tragedy came when confidence kept the answer from sounding urgent enough. In the end, the ignored ice reports before the Titanic show one of history's most painful patterns. A system can receive the truth in real time and still fail to translate it into action if prestige, routine, and momentum have already made slowing down feel less natural than proceeding into danger. Number 1. The warnings before Pompeii. Some warnings come through engineers, others through rumor or politics. Pompeii stands at number 1 because its warnings came from the earth itself, and people still stayed. That is what makes the case so chilling. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE is often remembered as sudden annihilation, but the deeper horror is that the region had not been entirely quiet beforehand. Earthquakes, tremors, instability, and the longer shadow of seismic unrest had already marked the landscape. The mountain did not erupt into a world of perfect calm. It erupted in a place already being warned. What gives Pompeii such power in historical imagination is the scale of normal life continuing under those signs. Houses were repaired after earlier quakes. Commerce resumed. People adapted. That adaptation is crucial. Human beings are often capable of living beside warning for long periods if warning becomes part of the environment rather than a singular interruption. A city can begin treating disturbance as inconvenient normality. Once that happens, the future becomes very difficult to distinguish from the background noise of ordinary survival. And that is what makes Pompeii darker than a simple natural disaster. The warning was not only one tremor or one omen, it was the cumulative reality of a volatile landscape that people had learned, psychologically and practically, to inhabit. This is one of history's most frightening truths. We are often most vulnerable to catastrophe when we have become experienced enough with danger to stop reading it as the beginning of something worse. Familiar danger can feel safer than unfamiliar caution. There is also something especially ancient and haunting about how these warnings would have been interpreted. In the Roman world, unusual natural signs could be read religiously, symbolically, or pragmatically, but no framework guaranteed effective action. The mountain existed inside ordinary life, inside agriculture, villas, trade, and domestic routine. Warning did not arrive as one universally authoritative command to evacuate. It arrived as disturbance in a world still trying to remain itself. That is why catastrophe could still overtake so many people. The signs were real, but they were not organized into one decision strong enough to empty the city. What makes the case especially devastating is how vividly archaeology preserves the cost of that failure. Pompeii is not just a story of death. It is a record of ordinary life cut off while still believing there was time enough for one more moment. Rooms, streets, objects, bodies, and gestures all testify to the same terrible delay between warning and recognition. The city seems frozen at the point where the truth finally became undeniable, but by then denial was no longer the problem. Time was. And perhaps that is why Pompeii feels more universal than almost any other case in this video. The warnings before the disaster were strange, visible, physical, and ultimately insufficient to overcome the pull of normal life. People stayed near homes, businesses, temples, food, family, and routine, because routine is one of the strongest forces human beings know. To leave requires believing that the world you woke up in is about to stop being livable. That is a hard truth for any society to accept. That is why Pompeii stands at number 1. It captures the oldest and most tragic form of ignored warning. The earth itself speaks through tremor, instability, and unease, yet the living continue because they cannot easily imagine total rupture. Then rupture comes anyway. The mountain does not care whether the warning was understood as inconvenience, omen, or background noise. It only matters that when the final eruption begins, the window for listening has already closed. In the end, the warnings before Pompeii belong at the top of this list because they show how catastrophe can announce itself repeatedly and still fail to break the spell of ordinary life. The city did not lack signs. It lacked the human willingness to let those signs fully interrupt the world people still hoped was going to continue tomorrow.